Good morning. I'm Mayor Buddy Dyer, and I'd like to welcome you to the June 27, 2011 workshop of the Orlando City Council. The results of the census and census tract results are in, and it's no surprise. We are the fastest growing big city in Florida, and we gained over 50,000 new residents since the last census. And as you might suspect, some areas of the city grew faster than other areas. So we are going to start the redistricting process, and in large part we're mirroring what we did in the last reapportionment cycle in terms of the way we're going to constitute the redistricting commission, the time frames. Kyle has put in some extensive work on this, and I think this may be the largest book presentation that we've had here at City Council since I've been here. So Kyle, take it away.
And we're here today to talk a little bit about our redistricting process. As the mayor said, the census numbers came in a couple months ago. We now have them, and we're going to proceed along with the redistricting process. For most of you, this is familiar stuff. A lot of this is for the benefit of folks at home. We're trying to encourage as much public input as possible. So part of the purpose behind this workshop is for folks at home to get an idea of what the redistricting is all about. For Commissioners Lynham and Sheehan, this will be old hat. You went through this 10 years ago. The mayor has gone through the redistricting process a couple times at the state level. We're going to go through a background and purpose of redistricting. We're also going to go through the legal background. There's a lot of law that impacts the manner by which you redistrict city commission districts. We're going to go over an overview of the census numbers and how they impact each of your existing districts. We're going to go over the Redistricting Advisory Board, and then we're going to go over 3 council agenda items, 2 of which are on the agenda today. So why are we here? We're here because of the constitutional principle of one person, one vote. Look at this example I have for you on the screen. In 1960, Jefferson County, Alabama, there was a state senate district that had 600,000 people in it, more than 600,000 people, but they had only one state senator. A nearby county, Lowndes County, Alabama, at that same time had 15,000 people and one state senator. That's a 40-to-1 ratio, which means that the people in Jefferson County, their vote counted for 1/40th of a vote of someone in Lowndes County. Lowndes County had 40 times the representation. Their vote was worth 40 times more than folks in Jefferson County. Here's another example. In District A, you have 53,000 people and 1 representative. In District B, you have less than 30,000 people, 1 representative. That means that the people in District A, their vote is worth 78% more than the people in District A. Imagine if somebody told you that your neighbor had a vote that was worth 78% more than you. That's not a hypothetical. That is District 1 today in the city of Orlando, based on the 2010 census. Commissioner Diamond's current district, 53,000 people. And District 2 has 30,000 people. Okay. This malapportionment results in what the courts call vote dilution. The solution is every 10 years to redistrict. You usually do it right after the census. Some communities do it more frequently. Some communities that don't grow nearly as quickly as the city of Orlando and other Sun Belt cities may not have to do it every 10 years. But for most cities, you do it every 10 years right after the census. From the earliest days of our republic, legislators realized that once you redistrict, you could draw those lines in a way that would benefit or disadvantage particular groups. In 1812, the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Elbridge Gerry, had a district drawn to favor his political party. At that time, it was the Democratic-Republican Party against the Federalist Party. And he, by the way, interesting note, he went on to become the 5th Vice President of the United States under James Madison, which is a little bit ironic because, of course, James Madison was the one that wrote in Federalist Paper number 10 that political parties, or as he called factions back then, were a threat to the republic and could become entrenched. Yet his vice president is the namesake for what some people blame for that entrenchment of political parties, that gerrymandering. Gerrymandering can be benign, meaning done for good purposes, or it can be insidious, done for bad purposes. Here's a quick example. You have 4, let's say you had hypothetically 4 districts in your parliament or your legislature, and you divided those districts out. The purple dots represent whatever minority, language minority, racial minority, or political minority you want to call. The blue dots represent your majority. If you drew the lines in this manner, the purple party would be at a disadvantage when it came to electing representatives of their choice. If you drew the districts this way, though, same 4 districts, the purple party is now advantaged in one of those districts. So the manner by which you draw these districts impact who has a legitimate chance of being elected to your legislative body. Now, as I mentioned to you, it's usually after the census every 10 years that you do redistricting. The census is one of those few things laid out in the Constitution that the government has to do every 10 years, Article 1, Section 2. The original purpose behind the census, of course, was to allocate amongst the states the seats in the House of Representatives. Now there's 435. There hasn't always been 435. Florida, of course, is a rapidly growing state. After the 2000 census, Florida was awarded 2 additional seats in the House of Representatives, going from 23 to 25. In this past census, the question was whether we were going to get 2 additional seats or 1. And then, as it came out, we wound up with 2 additional seats in the House of Representatives. So we've gone from 25 seats to 27. An interesting note is that one of those may be here in Central Florida. The talk is that Central Florida may get one of those additional seats. In the 70s, the Congress told the Census Bureau to take that data that they get and not only give it to the states for purposes of reapportionment, but also give it to the states for purposes of redividing state legislative districts and then also local government single-member districts such as ours. So we get that data. We've had that now, and we'll use that for our redistricting. Okay, I don't mean to bore anybody. We're going to go over a little law here. For a long, long time, redistricting was ignored by a lot of states, and they allowed districts to get malapportioned. And for a long time, the federal courts did not accept lawsuits trying to get redistricting to more equally allocate seats in the various legislatures. And they hid behind a doctrine that every law student will learn in their first-year law class called the political questions doctrine. And what the court said is that's a political question, we're going to leave it to the states. But in 1962, Tennessee plaintiffs brought a lawsuit in the case called Baker versus Carr, which for the first time the court said, you know what, that idea of not redistricting when you need to, that malapportionment violates the basic principles of our Constitution, including the 14th Amendment. And we're going to force states to reapportion their single-member districts. A couple of years later was the big case, Reynolds versus Sims. This was a challenge to the Alabama districts. That example that I first gave you at the very beginning of the presentation, that was from the Reynolds versus Sims case. That was, by the way, not an unusual disbalance back then, that 40 times more weight in one county to the other. Sometimes it was over 100 times or 200 times. So that was not unusual back then. The court said in this case the right of suffrage, the right to vote, can be denied by dilution of the weight of a citizen's vote just as equally as if you denied them the right to vote altogether. 14th Amendment, one of the 3 Reconstruction-era amendments to the United States Constitution, 13th, 14th, 15th. 13th, of course, prohibited slavery. The 15th guaranteed black men the right to vote. Of course, women weren't constitutionally guaranteed the right to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. You see there a very important part of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. That Equal Protection Clause was the basis for a lot of civil rights legislation and decisions out of courts throughout the 20th century. This case came actually a year before the Reynolds case, but it has the, quote, one person, one vote. It's Gray versus Sanders. And it's worth repeating. The conception of political equality from the Declaration of Independence to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to the 15th, 17th, and 19th Amendments can mean only one thing, one person, one vote. A few years later, in 1965, there was a very important statute passed, federal statute, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You see Lyndon Baines Johnson handing one of the signing pins over to Dr. Martin Luther King there. Outlaw discrimination and voting practices prevalent throughout the South at that time. Voting Rights Act was often referred to as one of the crown jewels of the civil rights movements. It prohibits political subdivisions, including local governments, from imposing voter qualifications, prerequisites to voting, things like poll taxes and literacy tests that were widely used at that time. Section 2, which was amended in 1982, is important. It is employed by plaintiffs in challenges to local government redistricting plans that dilute the strength of minority communities, language minorities and racial minorities. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 requires political subdivision to draw districts where minorities have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice if, and there's a three-pronged test laid out for the first time in the Jingles case in 1986, where the minority population is large and compact, politically cohesive in their voting patterns, and where there's a history of politically cohesive majority voting patterns that deny minorities the opportunity to win office. A few years later in Shaw versus Reno, the Supreme Court said jurisdictions covered by the Voting Rights Act are not given carte blanche to engage in racial gerrymandering. And if there is districts that are drawn so bizarrely that they can be explained only by race, that they will be given strict scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. Okay, so on the one hand, you have the Voting Rights Act saying where you need to draw districts where minority populations can elect representatives. And by 1993, the Supreme Court is saying, but don't go too far with that. You can't gerrymander for just racial purposes only. A few years later, in a series of cases called the Cromartie cases out of North Carolina, you see the court say race may not be the primary motivation in redistricting. This case came out just before redistricting 10 years ago. Okay. And what the court says there is it says, in assessing a jurisdiction's motivation in drawing district lines, it is a complex endeavor requiring court to inquire into all available circumstantial and direct evidence. And what the court said in that case is they're going to look at everything that the local government does and says when trying to decide whether race was the predominant factor in drawing these lines. In this case, they even looked at staff emails. Staff had sent emails from one another, and then some members of the Redistricting Advisory Board, it wasn't called that, but that's what it was in North Carolina, had even made public comments about why they were redistricting the way they were. And the court said, we'll look at those things to decide whether that shows the intent to racially gerrymander. In other words, this area is one of those areas where courts will look at not just what you do, but the things you say and utter, even staff, in trying to determine whether you have redistricted illegally or not. The one case that is relatively new and just came out a couple years ago, Bartlett v. Strickland, this is the biggest case in the last 10 years to come out, and it says that racial minorities do not meet the Jingles test of requiring a sufficiently large and a compact voting population if they are not quite 50% of the majority. So, in other words, it's called a crossover district, or don't count towards the Jingles test. A crossover district is where you have a minority group that is relatively compact, but not quite 50% of the population in that area. And so what it means there is if your racial minority has lost their majority status in that particular geographic area, they no longer qualify for that particular protection under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, let me ask you to focus your attention on this, because this is a very important slide. When we say that we are redistricting, and what we're trying to do is get substantially equivalent populations in each of our 6 single-member districts, you'll recognize right away that it'll be very, very difficult to get literally equality in every 6th district. Okay? Now, the state, by the way, last time when they redistricted, they, of course, have 120 seats in the state House and 40 Senate seats. They got pretty close. They got within just a few voters in each one, but of course they gerrymander in these bizarre patterns, and so they were able to do that. In our particular case, where you may want to do things like keep neighborhoods together and keep communities of interest together, you don't have quite that luxury. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, how close do you have to get to perfect equality in each of those districts? Now, what the courts have said is, starting in a series of cases back in the early 70s, starting with the Gaffney case, is that if you get within about 10% deviation, meaning 5% above or 5% below the ideal district size, and you'll hear us say that over and over again, the ideal district size. And you get the ideal district size by taking your total population of your city and divide it by the number of single-member districts you have, which is 6. I'll give you that number here in a moment. But what the Gaffney case is, as long as you get within 5% above or below in each of your districts, you're usually okay. But here's the thing, you'll sometimes hear people say that the Gaffney deviation is a safe harbor, that as long as you get within 5% plus or minus, you're okay, and the courts will never question what you did. That is not exactly 100% accurate. As you see here in 2004 in a case called Cox v. Larios, appellate invites us to weaken the one-person, one-vote standard by creating a safe harbor for population deviations of less than 10%. The court properly rejects that invitation. Now, it's something a little peculiar here. This case was affirmed on, it was called summary affirmance, so it has limited precedential value. But it is written by the Supreme Court, and so what they've signaled to us is that don't assume that that Gaffney deviation is always a safe harbor. You have to justify any deviation other than perfect equality, because anything other than perfect equality is not guaranteeing somebody one person, one vote. Okay? Now, real quick, you'll get this question from time to time. Back in November, the voters of Florida amended the Florida Constitution with Amendments 5 and 6, and Amendment 5 and 6 prohibits drawing districts to favor or disfavor incumbents and political parties. These amendments do not apply to the City of Orlando. They don't apply to any local government. They only apply to state legislative districts, the 120 seats in the House and the 40 seats in the State Senate, and then now the 27 congressional districts allocated to Florida. Okay? So if anybody asks, these rules don't apply by law to the City of Orlando. Here's what the Orlando City Charter says. It says that you'll redesignate the boundaries of each district after each decennial census. All such redesignation of district boundaries shall be in accordance with the Constitution. It goes without saying. Here's an important provision in the city charter. It says district boundaries must be changed not less than 4 months prior to a regular municipal election. Okay? And that makes sense. That's so that people that are looking to run for office, to run for elected office, know where their district is. Okay? The Sunshine Law and Florida's Ethics Code applies to the Redistricting Advisory Board that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But to be clear, and several of you have asked this question, the Redistricting Advisory Board is covered by the Sunshine Law, which means their meetings have to be open for the public, where the public can watch and see what they do. But of course, the Sunshine Amendment does not apply to your discussions with individual members of the Redistricting Advisory Board. So your nominees you can talk to. Okay, and you should. We encourage you to talk to your nominees and tell them what you think. What they can't do is meet amongst themselves without being in a sunshine meeting. Okay, the City of Orlando's ethics policy also applies to the Redistricting Advisory Board. Okay, so let's talk about the census numbers a little bit and what they say about the City of Orlando. You see here the city's population figures over the last 50, 60 years. Today's population, based on the census, and by the way, the census data is based on Census Day 2010, that's April 1st, 2010, is 238,916 people living in the City of Orlando. So you see some pretty rapid growth over the last 60 years. Here's a heat map of population density within the City of Orlando. Okay, so the hotter the color, the more dense the population. Now let me ask you just to focus. I'm going to switch over to 2010 in a moment. This is 2000. And I want you to focus your eyes down there just to the east of Lake Nona. This is 2000. That's 2010. Okay? 2000, 2010. So you get an idea of where some of the growth in the city has been. So here's the citywide demographic numbers. There's been about a 27% increase in the city's population. Again, Orlando is the fastest growing large city in Florida. Look down there at the bottom to the growth in the Hispanic population of Orlando, almost doubling in 10 years. So what's the ideal district size? In 2000, with 188,200 people, the ideal district size was 31,367. In 2010, the ideal district size is 39,819. So that's the goal. Okay, that's what you're shooting for, each of the 6 districts to be that size. Now, while I've given the warning about the Gaffney deviation, just as a rule of thumb, if you wanted to know what 10% deviation is, that would mean on the low side 37,828 and on the high side 41,810. Again, That's just a benchmark so you understand what 10% deviation is, understanding that you have to justify any deviation within that range other than perfect equality. Okay, let's go through the districts real quick. This is District 1 as it was drawn in 2000, or sorry, 1991. This is District 1 during the 90s. Okay? The next slide will show you the district as it was redrawn in 2001 without annexations that occurred throughout this past decade. Okay? So here's District 1 with annexations that occurred throughout the decade. Okay? Geographically, the largest district in the city. Here's District 1's demographics. District 1 was the fastest growing district over the past 10 years. 67% growth in that district. And if you look down there at the bottom, the African American population in District 1 more than doubled, and the Hispanic population also way more than doubled. The ideal district size is there. So District 1 has 13,000 more people than the ideal district. Okay, so it's a third bigger than it should be compared to the ideal district. District 2 during the 90s, represented by Commissioner Ortiz today. District 2 in the last decade without annexations, and District 2 with the annexations. Demographics of District 2. See the Hispanic population in District 2 grew again. District 2 has about 10,000 too few people compared to the ideal district. Okay, that's a quarter smaller than the ideal district. District 3, represented by Commissioner Stewart today, during the 90s. In the last decade, the big change, of course, was adding Baldwin Park from District 4, that was the Navy Training Center back then, into District 3 today, with annexations. Demographics, it grew by about a quarter. The African American population almost doubling. The ideal district size, you'll see District 3 is pretty close to the ideal district size. Okay, it's only 2% smaller than the ideal district. District 4, represented by Commissioner Sheehan today. There it is in the 90s, and you'll notice at that time it had the Navy Training Center. Now watch this district because this one changes fairly dramatically between the 90s and the last decade. Okay? With annexations. Demographics of District 4. District 4 grew quite a lot over the last decade, 40% growth. Look at the African American growth in the district, almost 3 times. Hispanic population almost doubled. So District 4 has almost 5,000 too many people in it compared to the ideal district. That's 12% too big. District 5, represented by Commissioner Daisy Lynham. District 5 in the 90s. District 5 in the last decade. District 5 with annexations. District 5's demographics. See the Hispanic population again grew. The population of the entire district grew by 2%. District 5 has 7,000 too few people in it compared to the ideal district. 18% smaller than the ideal district. District 6, represented by Commissioner Sam Ings, in the 90s, in the last decade with annexations. Demographics of District 6, 29% growth. See the Hispanic population more than doubled in District 6. And District 6 is just about right. 178 people too few compared to the ideal district. Okay, that was an overview of the demographics of the last district, and this is obviously stuff that the Redistricting Advisory Board will digest with a little more specificity over the next couple months. Let me now go over the council agenda items that we are proposing for your approval, the first 2 being on the agenda today, Ordinance 2011-27, and the Redistricting Advisory Board resolution. On July 11th, we'll bring back a resolution authorizing the mayor to set election dates. Ordinance 2011-27. This is on the agenda today for first reading. It'll come back for second reading on July 11th in a public hearing. Currently, the city code sets municipal election dates as one of two dates, either the second Tuesday in March or possibly under a couple different circumstances, the presidential preference primary. The presidential preference primary, of course, is not set by the City of Orlando. It's set by the state legislature. This ordinance proposes to permanently set that date consistently on the same date every other year. Excuse me, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in April. It also fixes the terms of elected office. There's little inconsistency in our code with our charter. The charter says that terms of elected office start on June 1st every other year. There was an outlier in our code that said May 1st. It should have been June 1st, so this clarifies that it's June 1st to be consistent with our charter. Okay, Ordinance 2011-27. Why are we proposing setting a fixed date for municipal elections? One, we think it offers predictability and regularity to when our elections are, rather than having them possibly move around. It allows the municipal elections to occur on the same date in mayoral and non-mayoral years. In years where you have the mayor's race, where you have districts 2, 4, and 6 up for re-election, you could have them on one date. Whereas in the years that you have the odd-numbered districts, 1, 3, and 5, you would always have them on the second Tuesday in March. Okay, so this would add predictability. It would also mean you have more predictable turnout because you wouldn't accidentally be falling on the presidential preference primary every 4 years or so. The big reason for this, and this is a real issue for us this time, is that the presidential primary can move, and the state legislature has been moving it. In 2000, they moved it. Back then, the Florida legislature thought that Florida should play a more important role in the selection of the presidential nominees for each of the two major political parties. So rather than going in March, would put Florida behind a lot of other states, including very small states like Iowa and New Hampshire. The Florida legislature moved up the presidential preference primary to the last day in January. Excuse me, the last Tuesday in January. This last term, they changed that yet again. And they changed that again because there was a lot of controversy over Florida moving its presidential preference primary to January because it went ahead of some of the traditional states that went before Florida. The two major political parties have a tradition and history of course, Iowa caucus going first, New Hampshire primary going second, and then the South Carolina and Nevada primaries going next. And if you move out of that order, which Florida did, the two major political parties can penalize your state's delegates at the National Convention. So in this last legislative term, just a couple months ago, the Florida legislature changed the presidential preference primary date yet again. The problem is we don't know when it is, because rather than resolving on a date, which they found to be highly controversial, a law was passed to establish a presidential preference primary date selection committee. And that committee is comprised of 3 members appointed by the President of the Florida Senate, 3 members by the Speaker of the Florida House, and 3 members by the Governor. And they will select the primary date. So we don't know when it is. We have no idea when the presidential preference primary is going to be, and we won't know until at the latest October 1st, assuming there's not a special session of the Florida legislature and assuming that the litigation that has been brought against that law is not successful. The problem with not knowing when the presidential preference primary is, besides the obvious, just you all not knowing when your election is going to be, is that it's too late to set a date in a redistricting year. You remember, we have to redistrict 4 months before the municipal election. The presidential preference primary date selection committee, if they meet on October 1 and set a date at the beginning of January, that's less than 4 months. So that would create problems for us. It is also too late for the alternative method of qualifying. As each of you know, you can qualify to run for office here at the City of Orlando by paying the statutory fee in Chapter 90 or 9 of the Florida statutes, or you can also qualify by petition. That qualifying by petition requires you to file an affidavit or an oath of need 160 days before the municipal election. So again, we need to know when our election day is going to be. City and county voting precincts are, of course, different. That causes some confusion, primarily because you have different ballots. Your neighbor, of course, might not live in the city of Orlando. While you do, you have 2 different ballots. Marrying the elections causes ballot confusion. If the Presidential Date Selection Committee sets a date for the presidential preference primary in the beginning of January, with our terms of office beginning on June 1st, you could conceivably have a lame duck session of City Council of, 4.5 months or something along those lines. That's a long lame duck session. Back when we switched the city code back in 2007, amended the city code back in 2007 to marry the presidential preference primary with the municipal elections, at that time we told you that was a temporary change for 2008, so this will permanently fix that temporary change. Divorcing the date from the PPP will also allow the supervisor of elections ample time to redeploy all the machinery of an election, including literally the machinery, but then also all the people and all the human resources that go into holding an election. Another important reason for separating city municipal elections from presidential preference primaries, of course, our charter has, since time immemorial, said that our municipal elections are nonpartisan in nature. And what that means is that you don't have to be a member of one of the 2 major political parties. The 2 major political parties don't hold a primary to decide which nominee will go on to the general election. In that vein, staff recommends that you not hold municipal elections on a presidential preference primary when in almost every year you'll have a lopsided turnout. You'll have an artificially partisan turnout. In most years, you don't have both major political parties with viable, meaningful primaries. Because usually you have a vice president running for election or a president, such as this year, running for re-election. You very rarely have both of the major political parties having viable primaries. The 2008 was an example, of course, where you had the Democrats with a competitive primary and the Republicans. But most years you don't have that. And this is very important. I can't underscore this enough. That statute, that bill that was passed in this last legislative session that moved the presidential preference primary, also it was a 150, 160-page bill, and it made some substantial changes to the way elections are conducted in the state of Florida. You all have probably heard about those. It includes changes to absentee voting and early voting. Our recommendation to you is not to hold the first election under those dramatically new election laws. Okay, next is the RAB resolution. This is on the agenda today for your consideration. It establishes the City of Orlando 2011 Redistricting Advisory Board. This is the same way we did this 10 years ago. We had a redistricting advisory board then. The resolution appoints members. Each of you nominated someone to represent your district. It provides the duties of the RAB and also requires the RAB to encourage public input and take public testimony. This is important. The RAB is going to make a recommendation to you. They're going to spend lots of time thinking about their recommendation and working on it. Excuse me. But it is only a recommendation to you. You ultimately have to make the decision about where those district lines are drawn. Okay? Here are the nominees. Here are the RAB nominees. I think some of them are here with us today, and I'm going to, if you'll just wave to your city council. The mayor selected Mr. Wayne Rich for chair. Wayne's right here. Wayne was my first boss here at the City of Orlando. He's the city attorney. Miss Stephanie Howe. Stephanie's back there. Hi, Stephanie. Tanya Juarez-Wilder. Is Tanya here this morning? I didn't see her yet. District 1's representative is Mr., I understand it's Angel Colon. Yes, sir. Is Angel here this morning? No. Mr. John Cabrera, right there, from District 2. District 3's representative is Mr. Cleve Frink. District 4's representative is Ms. Sarah Kelly. She's here. District 5's representative is Jacqueline Barr. Ms. Jacqueline Barr, is she here this morning? She's going to be the vice chair. She is our one alumni from last time. She was Commissioner Lineham selection last time. And District 6 representative is Bishop Alan Wiggins. That's the bishop here this morning. Okay. we ask for your support for those nominees this afternoon and adopt the resolution. The duties of the RAB set out in the resolution: gather and study the 2010 census data, create maps, share those maps and all the information with the public, encourage public input, meet regularly in public session, and then most importantly, prepare a recommended plan for redistricting. There's three shalls. There's three things that the Redistricting Advisory Board has to do. One, they have to make sure the plan has each of the single-member districts in contiguous territory. So you can't have districts that are separated from one another. Make each of them as nearly equal in population as practicable, and obviously conform to federal, state, and local law. Now, those are the three shalls. Here are the standards of redistricting that will serve as additional guidelines to the Redistricting Advisory Board. One, create compact districts. So prevent the districts from becoming sinuous and serpentine in pattern. Make sure they're as compact as possible. Avoid favoring and disfavoring any political party. This is from Amendments 5 and 6, even though Amendments 5 and 6 don't apply to us legally. They were overwhelmingly supported by the voters in the last election, so we placed those in the resolution as well. Draw boundaries where you can along streets and natural boundaries, okay, so that members of the public can easily understand where districts begin and end. Keep neighborhoods together within a district. This is an important one. Keep communities of interest together within the same district, and maintain the core areas of prior districts. So in other words, don't toss out the current map and start all over again. Public outreach will be a major component of the work of the RAB. They must encourage public observation and input. At their first or second meeting, they will adopt and implement a communications plan. They will implement a schedule of public meetings. 6 of those public meetings will occur out in the districts, so there'll be one in each of your districts. If you have a preference for where those are held, please let your nominee, your appointee, know so they can share that with the Redistricting Advisory Board. The RAB will accept and consider plans of redistricting offered by the public, and they'll create a website and an email address. The email address I'll share at the end here. We want to hear what folks have to say. Here's the RAB's timeline. RAB meetings will begin next month in July. We anticipate that a lot of the district hearings will occur during August. Again, by the way, this timeline is subject to approval by the RAB. They're going to set their own timeline, but this is just conceptually what we think today. RAB meetings will wrap up in September. They'll submit you a recommended plan of redistricting in October, and I'll allow you to adopt a plan of redistricting in the end of October, beginning of November. Just to give you a little comparison with the redistricting effort last time, the finish lines are the same. The last time the RAC was asked to come back at the beginning of October and set a deadline for the adoption of the recommended plan at the beginning of December. Just to give you a little preview of 2012 election timeline, of course, these won't be actually set in stone until the resolution authorizing the mayor to call the election by proclamation is adopted at the next city council meeting. But you'll see here that, roughly speaking, you're looking at mid-October for filing the oath of the alternative method of qualifying. At the beginning of December, redistricting must be complete to give us 4 months in between redistricting and the municipal election. Qualifying period would then be at the beginning, probably the first week in February. That has to be done 60 days before the municipal election. Election date that we're proposing is April 3, first Tuesday after the first Monday. If necessary, a runoff election has to occur about 4 weeks. The code says approximately 4 weeks after the first election, so that would be May 1st, with terms of office commencing in 2012 on June 1st. So on July 11th, we'll bring back a resolution implementing that. The resolution will authorize the mayor to issue a proclamation calling the 2012 municipal elections, and we'll also set the runoff date. Here's the staff that will be supporting the Redistricting Advisory Board. Linda Rhinesmith from the Economic Development Department. Trinity Tesler from Neighborhood Services and Communications. Mike Mills from Technology and Management. He's our GIS guru. He made all these beautiful maps that you saw this morning. Cindy Sanford, our paralegal in the City Attorney's Office. and me. We're proud to work for you. We look forward to it. Okay, so we're here to answer any questions, take any comments you have. You'll see up on the screen the email address to the RAB. For folks at home, we encourage you to use that email address. Write us and tell us what you think. rabrab@cityoforlando.net. That email address is live today. So please tell us what you think. If you have any questions, email us there. You can also write us here at the City of Orlando.
Thank you, Kyle. Very good presentation. Very thoughtful. Do we have, I probably should ask you this before, I assume there is software for drawing maps these days. I know when I first started out, we were hand drawing maps, and it was pretty time consuming to add or delete, but I assume you can draw 100 maps in a few seconds now.
Yes, sir. There's very good software, and we have purchased a license for that software. We will have that software publicly available for everyone to come into City Hall and draw their own maps if they would like to. It'll be available to the members of the Redistricting Advisory Board to sit down and draw their own maps.
Okay, so any citizen can come in, and where are we going to set that up?
Somewhere on the second floor. Have we decided? I don't know that we've set a room yet. Oh, on the 6th floor. Pardon me. Okay, so we'll have that available, publicly available on the 6th floor. Of course, we recommend someone scheduling time to sit down so that we have time for everybody to use it. But it will be publicly available. And the software is very, very good. If you can use a web browser, you can use this software. Of course, we'll be there to help as well if somebody needs some assistance. It is very easy to use. It is much better than it was 10 years ago. You don't need to be a GIS professional to use it. So we're very excited about it.
Okay, good. And then just the other comment is thank you, commissioners, for getting your picks in a little earlier, so I was able to add mine and make sure that we had a very balanced RAB, and I'm very proud that it is, I think, very reflective of our city now. It's 3 Caucasians, 3 African Americans, and 3 Hispanics, and then 5 men and 4 women. So I think and age varies too. So I think we are pretty representative of the city of Orlando. Okay, I've got Commissioner Sheehan, Commissioner Stewart, and then Commissioner Diamond.
Well, thank you, Mayor, and Kyle. Thanks for the overview and having gone through this before. It's a lot of fun. But I just had a couple of things I'd like to say. I mean, my neighborhood, Colonial Town, had always been traditionally split in half, and it was really hard for us as we were working with our district commissioner because sometimes on issues, the district commissioners had very different points of view in the same neighborhood, and trying to get our elected leader to represent us was crazy sometimes. So, I mean, I worked hard in the last redistricting to make sure that my neighborhood was united, and I think that that's a very important point to make in moving forward, that if we can keep these neighborhoods intact, that's very critical. And also, I still don't have the neighborhood boundaries for Colonial Town correct on the maps, which was a little frustrating. As Sarah and I went over the map over the weekend, it still doesn't reflect the correct boundaries at Colonial Town. So if we could get that fixed. I mean, I worked with the Neighborhood Association and Neighborhood Services, but apparently they still don't have the correct boundaries for Colonial Town. So if we could get that corrected, that would be great, because I used to be president of the Colonial Town Association. If I wasn't in that neighborhood, I certainly couldn't have served as the president, treasurer, secretary all those years. So again, I just want to make sure those reflect the actual boundaries of the neighborhood. I don't know if that's reflected anywhere else, but if we can make sure we get those corrected. And I'd just like to talk a little bit, too, about the fun of running during the presidential preference primary when your dates are moved up. I was doing the alternative petition method, and, trying to run when you think that your election is going to be, at the time, I think it was March, having it moved up to January, that affected all the other dates in terms of when we were supposed to file everything, so we're always having to scramble to figure out when things were due. I ended up being 26 signatures short because my dates got moved up by, a month and a half, and I really didn't think that was fair. I also don't think it's fair to challengers. Believe me, I like a little rock and roll. I like to run. I like to get out and talk to people. I like to do that. And by having them in January, you basically don't have a lot of time to campaign during the holiday season. I think it just opens it up for more people to run when you actually have them in March. Plus, it's also a lot better walking.
Yeah.
And, boy, you try walking in August and September in Florida, it's not nearly as good as it is when you're walking in, January and February. It's a lot more amenable if you want to do it the old-fashioned way, which is the way that I like to do it. So, anyway, it was very challenging. There was also the problem with people being very upset about being disenfranchised from both parties, because at the time they were talking about pulling the delegates from the Republicans and the Democrats.
Right.
And I was having to deal with the people who were angry about that process that had absolutely nothing to do with my local election. I just wanted to run my own thing. I want brick streets. I want historic districts. I want sidewalks. I'm trying to talk about local issues, and they're talking about national stuff on both sides. And I didn't have those answers for them, and I just really didn't think it was fair that I had to deal with all those ancillary issues that had absolutely nothing to do with my campaigning and going door to door, because I happened to be the only person that knocked on that door that was political in nature.
Right.
So,
Understood.
Yeah, that's a reason why I favor this too, because again, if you're going to go out there and do it the old-fashioned way and knock on doors and the way that I think that you should run for office, this is the best and most efficient way to do that, and opens it up to the most people at the time. So that's why I support it.
Thank you for your support, Commissioner.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Commissioner Stewart.
Thank you, Kyle. Great presentation, and I felt a little bit like a student in law school. Thank you very much for...
I'm sorry, I did not mean to suggest.
You got to go through it, I understand. A couple of quick questions. Public access to software. I apologize for not hearing the entire answer. The plan is to have a license in which the public can be able to come in and,
Yes, sir.
and look at this as well.
Right.
Is that correct?
We've purchased a single license for the software, which allows us to use it as much as we'd like. The licenses aren't cheap, so we've purchased just one for that reason.
The second, one of the challenges that we'll have is timely progress of the RAB online. I know that when I was doing with the Edgewater Drive Vision Task Force and other task forces, as we begin to move, we can make sure, I guess, probably falls on Wayne's shoulders, that the minutes get reflected very quickly and get back out, so that you're going to have a lot of things happen weekly or twice weekly. So anything that can do to accelerate that for people can be kind of kept up to date.
Yes, sir.
In terms of that.
And you recall, the City of Orlando, we have a policy that says that minutes of sunshine committees have to be recorded within 5 business days. Most cities don't have that. The law just says a reasonable amount of time, but we have, by policy, said that means within 5 business days. So the city has a habit and a history of making sure those minutes are done very, very quickly.
Well, and I understand, and I believe that is a good policy. The challenge is that as you begin to look at the 6 meetings around the neighborhoods or districts, and you may end up having 2 or 3 meetings in a week. That's going to be a real challenge in getting that information out as well, from just a timing standpoint, because that's going to be the ones, I think, especially in District 3, they will want to see what happened in District 3, those who didn't come. Neighborhood maps, I think that Commissioner Sheen's got a good point in terms of the definition of neighborhoods. It may be worthwhile to meet with each of the commissioners to kind of review actually the definitions of the neighborhoods. I know, as an example, Park Lake definition extends all the way over to Orange Avenue. And so that creates a commercial portion of Park Lake, which really isn't part of the neighborhood, and that may want to be considered a different type of neighborhood definition right now in terms of that category. So that may be worthwhile to do relatively quickly. And then the demographic idea, the recap you've given us is a good recap, but the question is, in terms of the totals that you've given us, I'm trying to look and mathematically have you help explain to those who are listening, the role of Hispanic versus as a culture versus race, and how that's reflected in the demographic here.
Good question. I failed to mention this, and I should have earlier in the presentation. So let me be really, really clear about this. When the census asks folks for their race, one of the options is not Hispanic, of course, because Hispanic is not a separate race. And so those numbers will never add up. If you added up those numbers, black, white, Hispanic, they won't add up, because if you identify yourself as Hispanic, you're also identifying necessarily yourself as one of the other races, white, Hispanic, African American, Hispanic, or what have you. So Hispanic is not a race, but it is an option on the questionnaire. Now, to confuse matters even more, when the state of Florida registers voters, one of the options it gives you for your race is Hispanic. Okay, so in other words, if you look at the data from the census and the data from voter registration here in Florida, they'll never add up. They'll never mesh with each other. Okay, and so for that purposes, you can't look at those two and say, what, you know, why don't they add up? And so to be clear, Hispanic is not a race. It is a separate category on there, and that's why those numbers will never add up to meet the total population. The other thing I'd just point out in those demographic details we set, the census, of course, has other race categories, including other, which means that you identify yourself as not belonging to one of those categories, Native American, white, black, Pacific Islander, or what have you. And other is increasingly a category that folks are selecting on that. So those numbers won't add up for both of those reasons.
So let me kind of ask this question. I don't want this to be taken negatively, but a person who is Hispanic by culture, who may also see himself as Hispanic by race, may answer other to
Yes,
the
sir.
race and then answer Hispanic in terms of culture.
Yes, sir. That's absolutely
So it creates kind of this weird
Right.
demographic analysis.
Right. You're absolutely right.
Is there a way to get the detailed demographic? I would assume that information is available and obviously would be available to the committee. Is there a way for us to get that information as well, both to the city as well as the districts?
Linda is nodding her head. Yes, we'll get that for you.
All right, perfect. And I would assume that's also maybe available if asked upon by neighborhood too, but I'm assuming that's kind of where the software steps in. All of a sudden you click into something.
Linda is saying you can do that by blocks, but you can't drill down any smaller than blocks. And blocks mean something in the census world. Okay, so you
Right.
have census designated
Right.
places, census tracts, and then census blocks, which are the smallest territories that the census counts.
Well,
and
it's
gathers
unfortunate
data.
the federal government didn't ask us how to do census blocks, because we would have solved that problem for them here
It would
locally.
have been very simple. Of course, they'd have had to ask 7,000 other local governments too. But
Yeah, that's. Thank you very much. I appreciate your work and appreciate Wayne, thank you for your leadership and for the leadership of the committee. This is we do a lot of small things, have committees that do a lot of small things that have this enormous impact. This is one of those occasions where good quality citizens will have an enormous impact on how we govern over the course of the next 10 years. And it's very important to us and very important to our city, and I thank you all for that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Diamond.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to suggest that we take the resolution establishing the RAB board and change it. I think the RAB board ought to finish their work earlier. I think we as a city council ought to commit to finishing our work earlier. Frankly, I think it's irresponsible that we've let the redistricting process just sit while Orange County government and the school board have been busy working on theirs for months. I think the net result of this is that the taxpayers are going to get stuck paying for a separate election. 4 years ago, the estimate was that it would have cost $123,000 for this election. One can only imagine how much it's going to cost in 2012, but I think that's wrong. I think that's something that we as a city certainly can't support, and I think it's something that's wrong. I also think that it is still entirely possible for people to get their petitions together if they want to run for the commission. Kyle forgot to tell us about Section 21.07-1 of the code, which lets city commission candidates get their petitions from anywhere in the city, not just their district. So when they try to get their 3% of petitions, which is about 600 petitions, they can get them anywhere, any district, any registered voter in the city. And the reason why that provision is in there is because the people that wrote the code years ago anticipated that we'd have a situation like this. And I think it's just irresponsible to spend taxpayer money on a separate election. I think that's wrong, and I'm not going to support that. And during our agenda meeting, I'm going to move that our resolution for the redistricting committee be put on new business and the deadlines change so we can meet these deadlines. Thank you.
Commissioner Ings.
Thank you, Mayor. Kyle, thank you so much for your presentation. I'd like to ask, is Walter Hawkins a part of this staff too? Because you failed to call his name. And
Oh,
you know,
did I? I'm sorry.
Yeah, he's in the back. He's watching you.
Walter Hawkins from the Economic Development Department. I apologize. I'm
All
sorry.
right. Would you explain the Bartlett versus Strickland piece, and
Yes.
specifically looking at the jingles and crossover districting?
Yes, sir. In the Jingles case, the court said that plaintiffs had a cause of action under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 if they could demonstrate that the minority population that was being disadvantaged was cohesive enough, large enough, and compact enough to constitute a majority in a single-member district. What the Strickland case from just a couple years ago said is that that does not mean that the local government has to gerrymander a district in a peculiar fashion in order to create a minority access district. What they have to do is create a district where the minority population is a majority but is relatively compact. Okay? So what some plaintiffs had over the years said is that even if the minority population is compact and, say, is 45% of the population, that they could still bring a Jingles claim if they could claim that some other minority population was an ally of it in historic voting patterns, and that together they created a crossover district. Okay? What that case said is that those crossover districts are no longer the basis for a Jingles claim. In other words, just to boil it down to plain English, if the minority population is not a majority in a compact area, then you don't have a Jingles claim. Okay?
Okay. And then also, in reference to the presentation that you gave today, is it possible to get this presentation on District 6's site?
Yes, sir, of course.
Okay.
Yes, we'll do that. We'll provide that for you. And we're also going to put this also up on the RAB's website as well. But yes, sir, we'll get it to you in a format that's appropriate for your website.
Okay. Thank you, and that's all.
Thank you, Commissioner Lynham.
Thank you. Thank you, Cal, for that history lesson, which leaves a little bit to be desired, since only because it wasn't accurate in the sense of the environment of our country at the time. African-American men were allowed to vote, but they didn't. So a lot of these laws really that went into effect were not in effect because of racial discrimination in the environment at that time. And actually, we still have voter suppression, but just check the last legislative session. So we may not have poll taxes, but we have other ways of discriminating and to make sure people do not vote. Try to prevent them from voting. But one statement I want to make about District 5 was that we lost in 10 years over 4,000 families out of Paramore. But we also gained, so if you're looking at those numbers, they're accurate to some degree because of the balance of the people we gained from the View, from Camden, from other places, City View. But we lost a significant number of people out of Paramore. And the last 8 years, we have not had hardly any annexation of residents in District 5. So that, unlike the previous 5 years, we were quite aggressive in that. But I want my residents, my constituents, to know that I didn't quite understand Commissioner Diamond's recommendation just now, but I am willing to get more information. Maybe at 12 o'clock I'll meet with you and find a little bit more, because it just wasn't resonating in my mind what it was that was going on. But my understanding, if we're talking about compact, which is not new to the law, hardly any of our districts are real compact, except for all majority districts. But anywhere there are minorities, we're kind of scattered everywhere. I think even District 4 looks like a U because they had to come up and pick up Millennium Mall last time. But I understand that if we were trying to keep them at least contiguous to other compact neighborhoods, and that we do keep those neighborhoods together.
Yes, ma'am.
That would be it. But I like the idea of residents having an opportunity to weigh in. I think last time District 5 had a lot of excitement. A few neighbors in my neighborhood want to move to District 3. And I had to tell them, hell, we were in District 3. We didn't get anything done. So we went to District 5, and we still are, and I think it's a great district, and we're happy to be there. But for many years, just through this type of redistricting, my neighborhood was drawn into 5. Just as different neighborhoods move and change around, I think people need to just study the maps as best they can, know that they can't jump over a neighborhood. They've got to have some line of continuity through either I-4, John Young, 441. Something has to be contiguous for us to include it. But I think overall we gave a great presentation, is that people need to know the balances of history, but most people don't understand history, especially we have a lot of new residents, a lot of new citizens who really don't understand the real impact of the laws in the history of the United States of America, including the people who are descendants of it. So I think that's pretty much my point, was to show the great imbalance of 5 and what has happened. There's been growth, but it's been a different kind of growth because we've had so much relocation. I mean, just 4,000 families just moved out of a neighborhood is quite significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lynham.
Commissioner Sheehan?
I just had a couple of other points to make. You know, when we're going through this process, clearly some of us are going to lose neighborhoods, some of us will gain neighborhoods, and it's not that we don't enjoy representing them, especially since I'm going to probably have to lose some area. It's just that we have to make these fair, and it's not that we don't love these areas, it's just that it's necessity that dictates that. I actually gained in the last, I was one of the smallest district and had to gain last time. Now I'm in the opposite situation, and I'm sure we can work through that collegially.
A large part of my...
Yeah, and I'm glad that Commissioner Lynham brought that up, because I do support the minority-majority districts, and in order to do that, I had to do some shifting around, which, you know, looks very gerrymandered, but I wanted to support the minority-majority districts. And in that vein, Kyle, I wanted to ask, I mean, can we draw a Hispanic majority district? I mean, is that not okay for us to do based on some of the things that you've said? I mean, I think it is appropriate for us to have minority-majority districts, especially if we've got, you know, folks moving to, you know, population centers and stuff like that. So,
language minorities are protected under the Voting Rights Act, just like racial minorities are. Okay. What you can't do is use a category like race or something like race, cultural background, as the predominant and primary factor, but you may use other non-racial historic redistricting principles, such as keeping communities of interest together, such as keeping neighborhoods together, that result in exactly the same outcome.
Okay. And to Commissioner Lynham's point, too, we did try to annex Holden Heights, and they didn't want to come into the city, and that would have added significantly to our city population and African-American population. That was a shame. That really, I think, would have, you know, brought us, you know, to where we didn't have to actually annex. Well, we did have to annex, but would have evened out our borders significantly. But again, we can't just go in and seize them. They have to agree to come in, and unfortunately, that referendum failed. So we did try to.
But one half of Holden Heights is in the city because I represented it. Now somebody else does, maybe.
Okay.
Tangelo Park is another example.
Right.
Tangelo, that's the one. I'm sorry.
Oh, that, okay.
Park is
Yeah.
Tangelo
it wasn't
Park.
Holden Heights. It was
Right. It was okay.
Yeah, under the annexation statute, which we have to follow, we can't change. Of course, residential developments such as Tangelo Park have to vote by referendum, and it just makes it difficult sometimes to annex residential areas, whereas it's very simple to annex non-residential areas where no one lives, because all you have to do is get the property owner's permission.
Yeah. So I mean, we get criticized for not, you know, for having these non-contiguous areas, but we have tried to annex them, and then they just don't want to come in. We can't force them. So, you know, that's a difficulty that we have through the process. But
But it takes a lot of work.
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
the commissioner and you're
Sure.
county commissioner.
Sure.
And when you're not doing that, it doesn't work at all.
Well, interestingly enough, on the Tangelo Park one, it was the county commissioner that wanted us to annex Tangelo Park into the city of Orlando and ask us to go through that process. Okay, Commissioner Stewart.
Two quick questions. The first is probably relatively simple. Is there any other data that we can use for population estimates that's outside of the 2010 census information?
Yes, there is other data out there. The BEBR, which is at the University of Florida, which is the Bureau of Economic something Research, they also put together Florida demographic statistics as well. The census data is the best data, and it's the data that our charter suggests that we use, and it is also the one set of data that there's no doubt the courts don't mind you using. That doesn't mean that other data is not out there. It's just this is what you use for redistricting, and we're certain about that, so that's why we're going to use it. The other data that is sometimes out there that folks take a look at, of course, is voter registration data.
I think I'm asking kind of a leading question, which I think I probably know the answer to. In an area where we have a housing vacancies, where we know that those will be filled, I guess, in the next 10 years, and we know that, is there a chance that information can be taken into account that as we move forward, the idea being, let's pick a downtown, a condo building that's 25% vacant, and all of a sudden we have a very strong feeling that it will be occupied 3 or 4 or 5 years from now and will need representation. Is that something that can be taken in account, and is there a way to take that into account?
Yes, sir. I mean, our recommendation is that you use the census data to get to the ideal district, and because that's the best data available. Is it old? Yes, of course. It was the census population as of April 1st of last year. There have been births over deaths. There's been inward migration. Actually, you have a new constituent as of just a month ago that was not in the census.
That's right. Wasn't even anticipated.
Yes, just looking forward to good representation from you. But so we suggest using the census data. Now, if the RAB asks us for other data, other sources of data, whether it be BEBR or voter rate, we'll certainly provide that to them, though ask that they use that as background material as opposed to as the basis for the redesignation of the districts. I think all of us can, off the top of our head, think of areas of town that right now are going to grow over the next 10 years. And some redistricting advisory committees and boards over the years have intentionally put slightly fewer people in one district where they know there's likely to be rapid growth over the next 10 years. In other words, sort of compensating for that growth that is anticipated. Perfect example would be District 1. I think we all intuitively understand and believe that District 1 is likely to be the growth center again over the next 10 years. They can take those things into consideration, yes, sir.
Let me kind of go back to another subject along the same lines that we talked about earlier. In redistricting, let me ask the question specifically. Districts 1, 3, and 5 will actually can continue to serve, even, I think, if we are not included within, if we're zoned out or drawn out of our district. And then, so it brings up two questions. The first question is that what's the city charter that continues that service for us until our election again, if that were the case. And then the second question is, in terms of qualifying for people who are running for 2, 4, 6, and even probably the mayors, what's the criteria for living in the district or having proof of residency in the district?
Okay, two very good questions. And by the way, we're going to put up a frequently asked questions page on the RAB website and then a link from the city clerk's website to answer some of these questions because they're very good questions. Okay, the rule in our city charter says that if you currently are serving in your seat and for some reason are districted out of your seat, you do not lose your seat. You stay and continue through the remainder of that term. Okay, so you continue to represent even if you don't live in that district, but just for that term. Now, to qualify to run again at the next time, you have to live in that district, of course. Okay, so if you are districted out, you don't have to worry about losing your seat in the short term. You just need to make sure you move to the district in the future.
And then the second is the qualifying time for people to prove the district in the special election.
Okay. Our charter and code say that to qualify to run for office, you have to live within your district for the year before. Okay. The exception, though, is in redistricting years, because you don't know where your district is going to be. You only have to live in the city for a year rather than the actual district, okay? But that's just for redistricting years. In other years, you have to live in that district for the year before.
So is there any obligation for that person to move into the district prior to election or after election?
Elena, is it qualification or is it by election day? I can't recall.
It's by election day.
Election day, okay.
So someone who qualifies but having lived in the city that
For a
runs
ye-
technically outside of a district would have to be moved into that district by election day?
Right.
When they take their oath of office, they have to live in the district.
Okay, that's different than, okay, I apologize, that's a different question. So they have to be in by June 1st.
Yes, sir.
They get elected, they've got roughly a month or two to move in.
Correct.
And the city charter defines that clearly?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lynham?
I want to make a couple of comments. 63% of Floridians stated that we should have fair districts. I think that was more toward the state and Congress than for us. But I do remember with Commissioner Diamond, from the day he came on, because I served on the Municipal Planning Board, I continually told him his district would be the size of Winter Park. He would say something, I said, look, your district is going to be like Winter Park, so you're either going to get another commissioner down there, or something's going to happen. So those predictions weren't even predictions. It was just common sense. It did happen, though, didn't it? Mm-hmm. Right. You got a district down there the size of Winter Park, or larger, I think, probably than Winter Park. But I wanted to ask the question of I don't think that's an issue from what I can see of who's on this board now, other than Commissioner Diamond. Maybe getting sort of, and you're running for mayor, so it's not even an issue. With the size of that district being pushed back so far south and so far east, that he would probably be, if he were still a commissioner, running as a commissioner, not even in your own district. I mean, you would be the only person here I can think of. I don't even know where Tony lives, so I don't know. But right, that would be one of those
I don't know.
kind of situations.
I think Commissioner Sheehan's kind of close to the line in her district. I think she's fairly close to the northern side of her district, if I'm not mistaken. But you're right. I mean, I think the planning folks say that in the not-too-distant future, 1 out of 4 people is going to live in southeast Orlando. So,
right.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting about our growth pattern, but it was decided so many years ago with the annexation down there, and then, of course, with the movement of medical way and all of the institutions, and just so many things happened to, I mean, I knew from 94 when I was on Municipal Planning Board it was going to happen. So it's not new. But it was just interesting how all of this is happening, and it really isn't new for people who are paying attention. That district and probably a little bit of all of Orlando. And, of course, when Commissioner Hardage was in the county, and I have been talking to Commissioner Moore Russell, that he was very aggressive in getting annexations in 5 and 6 for his district, but we've not had, and there were some changes with the joint agreement with the city and county that has affected some of this, but a lot of it is, too, about relationships and how we do business. Mm-hmm. And I know I hadn't been that aggressive about it, but I am going to become, and I've already started talking with Commissioner Moore Russell about some of those annexations and possibilities that we do need to grow our city comparable to some other ethnicities, and that concerns me. Mm-hmm. So. But fine.
And one thing of interest, obviously I was not here for the last redistricting, but Kyle has told me that historically both the city and the county have tried to draw districts in a fashion that all of the districts converged back toward the urban core, so that everybody had a stake in the urban core issues, and maybe not all the way downtown, but at least toward the core, and that probably starts to get a little bit more difficult with the growth in the southeast. But I don't think that we would Wayne, want to draw a district that was so disconnected that the person representing that area only had thoughts about the southeast part of our city. But I know the drawing of these maps is going to be a little more difficult, trying to take that into consideration, too.
Yes, sir.
And you're correct, we did do that even when I was here 10 years ago, to make sure almost there was conversion, with
Kinda
everybody
like a
having a little piece or something,
spoke
or
in a
some
wheel.
town center,
Yeah.
or so that there will be some common interest or ground, so that you don't drive 30 miles to get to your house and then think you're going to be concerned about downtown
Right,
Orlando.
right.
So it was one of those things, and I noticed this time, with that pushback, with those boundaries, that it's going to be very interesting on how that's going to happen.
Let's see, Commissioner Sheehan.
Well, and because of a comment that was made, I also took the most changes in the last redistricting to accommodate, everyone else. And I used to be in the center of my district, if not for the fact that I was pushed. And I've represented my district from the top portion of my district for the last 10 years. So I really don't see that being that much of a problem, because truly, I took the most change in population and neighborhoods just because I wanted to basically accommodate everyone else. So I don't want it to be seen as the other way around. That's not at all what happened. I actually was very accommodating to the other district, minority, majority district concerns, and other things moving forward. That's why I took the most change. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle, for a very good presentation. Wayne, did you want to offer any thoughts, or just accept my thank you for taking on this challenge, and the rest of the members of the redistricting committee as well? Okay. And let me reiterate one point to the commissioners that Kyle made, which is the committee itself, its members are governed by the sunshine, but you are free to converse with Wayne and or any other member of the committee, although you cannot converse among yourselves about it unless it's a posted meeting, because we'll eventually vote on the maps after they make their recommendation. So that will conclude our workshop for the day.